Tonight, in the high medieval halls of England and France, a quiet training sword rests by the window. Its edge is dulled by practice, not battle. The air smells faintly of oil and rain. A flicker of candlelight trembles on the blade, as if it remembered something brave. You are safe here. The stone floor is cool beneath a weary foot, and a promise, long kept, hums softly in the rafters. A small question drifts in like lamplight. What did squires know that we forgot? It lingers where wood grain glows, and a leather gauntlet lies folded neatly on a chest, a symbol of duty, patience, and the ache of growing into one's place. We won't hurry. We'll follow softly, tracing the scent of straw and steel, like planning a day around a crowded schedule, hoping one moment of peace still fits inside. A window creaks. The world outside is damp with fog. A candle winks, as if it knows the ending before the tale begins. Beyond the courtyard, a horse stamps once, impatient for dawn. Somewhere, a young squire dreams of the day he'll be called Sir. If you're tired, let this story be your armor, fitting just right. Tonight, we'll follow softly, and we'll leave only quiet behind. And as the page turns, the doorway opens wider, inviting us to begin with a quiet smile. Hey friends, tonight we'll drift through the heart of the life of a squire, where loyalty was taught before love, and every dawn began with a scrape of steel on whetstone. The castle sleeps under a sky of wool-gray clouds. A single bell murmurs the hour, low and patient. In the kitchens, bread cools on open tables, its crust whispering against the chill. Down in the stables, hooves shuffle softly, stirring the scent of hay and damp leather. The courtyard stones remember every boot that crossed them, and in the armory, the air hums faintly, iron against iron, the rhythm of 1,000 mornings. Ink dries on a parchment list of chores, each task written with a hand still learning steady lines. The hearth crackles, a tiny applause for those who keep the night company. It's the kind of quiet where even the wind seems polite, where duty feels a little like love, and waiting feels like hope, like sneaking a text under the table during class. Small rebellions bloom even in the most obedient hearts. Before we begin, please like and subscribe only if this tale helps you unwind or sparks a quiet curiosity. In the comments, share where you're watching from, what time it is, or one small thing that made you smile today. Now lie back, let the world soften, and let's begin tonight's story. Hello, dear listener, and welcome to our tale of the Squire's Promise. Chapter 1. The Morning of Ash and Iron. The sun had not yet lifted its full weight over the horizon when Thomas stirred. He was 15, the age when dreams grow heavy with purpose, but mornings still feel unfair. His cot creaked beneath him, the straw inside flattened by restless sleep. From the courtyard below came the steady clink of buckets. Water, always water. He knew that sound better than his own heartbeat, the morning ritual that washed the mud, soot, and pride from the previous day. He swung his legs to the floor, shivering as his bare feet met the cold stone. The air smelled of ash, leather, and a faint sweetness from the kitchen fires burning yesterday's crumbs. Outside, a rooster crowed with theatrical confidence. Thomas smiled. "Show off," he whispered. The castle was already alive, though not yet awake. Pages darted between corridors like shadows. A maid passed by with a stack of folded linens, her steps careful not to disturb the stillness. Thomas pulled on his tunic, coarse wool, brown, a little too big at the cuffs. His training sword leaned against the wall beside him, the leather grip worn where his palms had sweated through 100 drills. It wasn't sharp, but it had weight, and in that weight was every dream he'd ever dared to think. He buckled his belt, slipped on his boots, and paused by the window. Outside, the courtyard waited, a patchwork of frost and footprints, edged by the low murmur of men preparing for another day of discipline. The knight he served, Sir Aldrich of Branton, was already at the training yard. Thomas could tell by the sound, a rhythmic clash of steel and shield that rolled through the morning like distant thunder. Sir Aldrich was a kind of man who made silence nervous, tall, weathered, and almost humorless, though his eyes had once been kind, or so the Lady Eleanor often said. Thomas admired him the way a sparrow might admire a hawk, with awe and a little fear. By the time he reached the yard, his fingers were numb from the cold. The ground was hard, the sky pale as pewter. Sir Aldrich was already circling a target dummy, striking clean, measured blows. Each motion was a sentence in a language Thomas longed to speak fluently. Late again, boy. Thomas froze. The knight hadn't even turned to look. I only a moment, my lord. One moment is the difference between life and death. Yes, my lord. A pause. Then, with a hint of amusement that passed like a cloud, fetch your sword. Thomas obeyed. The first lesson of being a squire was obedience. The second, endurance. The third, silence when the first two failed. Sir Aldrich nodded to the practice circle. Show me your guard. Thomas took his stance, feet apart, blade up, shoulders squared. The knight circled him once, twice, too stiff. You fight the sword, not the man. Let it breathe. Thomas tried again. The sword wavered, then steadied. Better. Again. They moved together, teacher and apprentice, the air between them ringing softly with every clash. The strikes were light, but they carried meaning. Between blows, Sir Aldrich spoke. A squire must think before he swings. The sword is not for glory. It is a promise. Thomas frowned. A promise, my lord, to protect what cannot protect itself. The knight's voice softened. To stand when others falter. To do what is right, even when it burns. The words lodged in Thomas's chest. He didn't yet understand them fully, but they carried the kind of truth that grows with age. They trained until the frost melted from the grass. When Sir Aldrich finally dismissed him, Thomas's arms ached, his tunic clung with sweat, and his heart felt strangely light. He found a quiet corner near the stables and sat on a bale of hay, catching his breath. From the doorway, Lady Eleanor watched him, her presence gentle, like the echo of a song. She was not noble by birth, but by grace. Her kindness carried more authority than her husband's commands. Hard morning? She asked. Thomas scrambled to stand. My lady, She waved a hand. Sit, Thomas. Even knights must rest. He smiled shyly and obeyed. She handed him a small loaf of bread, still warm. You remind me of Aldrich when he was your age, though he would never admit it. Thomas laughed softly. Was he so clumsy, too? Worse, she said with a knowing grin. He once dropped his shield in the river, trying to impress me. The image broke through Thomas's exhaustion, like sunlight through fog. Truly, truly, she said. Though he'd have me forget it, They sat in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of the courtyard filling the air, the snort of horses, the ring of hammer on iron, the distant chatter of the cooks. Then Lady Eleanor spoke again, quietly. "You have his heart, Thomas. The same stubborn loyalty. That will serve you well if you learn to temper it." "Temper it, my lady?" She nodded. "Steel that bends too soon is weak. Steel that refuses to bend shatters." Thomas looked down at his training sword. Its dull edge gleamed faintly in the morning light. "And a promise?" he asked. "Ah." Her eyes softened. "A promise is what keeps both from breaking." The moment lingered soft, unspoken, like the last chord of a hymn. That evening, as dusk rolled over the towers, Thomas sat by the hearth, oiling his sword. The flames painted the room gold. Sir Aldrich entered quietly, his armor set aside, his expression unreadable. "You fought well today," he said. Thomas looked up, startled. Praise from his master was rare. "Thank you, my lord." The knight studied him for a moment. "Do you know why I train you so hard?" "To prepare for knighthood." "No," Aldrich said. "To prepare for failure." Thomas blinked. "Failure?" "Yes. Every knight fails. Once, or many times. But the promise you keep, that is what endures." Outside, a wind stirred the banners. The firelight trembled across the steel. Thomas bowed his head. "Then I will keep mine, my lord." Sir Aldrich placed a hand on his shoulder, the gesture brief, but heavy with meaning. "Then perhaps one day, Thomas, you will understand what that truly means." And in the quiet that followed, as the castle settled into its nighttime breath, Thomas felt it not pride, not fear, but purpose, a promise forming in the stillness, one that would follow him far beyond the castle walls. Chapter 2. The Lesson of the Broken Shield. Morning came softly, a thin gold line brushing across the castle stones. The air was wet with dew, and the world seemed to whisper rather than speak. Thomas woke to the sound of the blacksmith's hammer 3 beats. Pause, then 3 again. A rhythm older than words, older than knights themselves. His body ached from yesterday's drills. Every muscle protested as he stretched. But beneath the soreness was something steadier. Pride. He had lasted through every swing, every parry. Even Sir Aldrich's silence at the end of training had felt almost like approval. Thomas dressed quickly, pulling on his wool tunic and fastening his belt with care. The training sword leaned against the wall, its handle gleaming from oil he had rubbed in last night before sleep took him. He had dreams of banners and sunlight of himself, riding beside Aldrich into some distant, imagined glory. But today was no day for dreams. Today was for chores. He hurried to the stables, where the horses steamed in the chill. They turned their heads toward him as he entered, the smell of hay and damp earth wrapping around him like a blanket. He whispered greetings to each by name, Rowan, Bristle, and Old Marin, because knights might earn songs, but squires earned trust in quieter ways. He brushed down Rowan's coat, careful over the scar at his flank. The horse leaned into the touch. "You understand?" Thomas murmured. "We're both still learning." By mid-morning, the yard was full of sound, wood striking wood, metal biting air. The other squires were already training, laughing between blows. Thomas joined them, and soon sweat gathered at his brow. Then Sir Aldrich appeared, tall against the sky, his cloak trailing like a banner of smoke. The laughter stopped. "Pair off," he said simply. "Shields and swords." Thomas's heart gave a small, foolish leap. He'd been practicing for this moment. How to block cleanly, how to hold his ground. He took his place opposite Geoffrey, an older squire with a grin that always seemed one word away from trouble. "Ready?" Geoffrey whispered. "As I'll ever be." They raised their shields. The first clash came like thunder. Wood met steel, the sound rolling through the yard. Thomas staggered, but held. Again, again. Each blow rattled his bones. Geoffrey was stronger, but Thomas had the patience of someone who'd been taught to listen between sounds. Then came a strike too sharp, too fast. Thomas lifted his arm just in time. The impact splintered his shield clean in two. Gasps broke around them. Thomas stared at the jagged edge where the wood had cracked. The rim still trembled from the blow. Shame flooded his chest like cold rain. Sir Aldrich's voice cut through the murmurs. "Stop!" The knight strode forward, his eyes unreadable. He lifted the broken shield from Thomas's arm and turned it in his hands. What did this shield fail to do? Thomas hesitated. "Protect me, my lord." "No." Aldrich's gaze met his. It failed to be respected. The words struck harder than the blow. "You held it wrong," the knight continued. "Too high, too proud. A shield is not for showing strength. It is for learning humility." He dropped the halves to the ground with a hollow clatter. "Fetch another." Thomas did as told, but his throat felt tight. As he passed the others, he heard whispers, not cruel, just curious. Everyone had broken something under Aldrich's watch. Still, it stung. When training ended, Thomas lingered in the yard, alone. The broken shield lay where it had fallen, its edges catching the light. He knelt beside it, running his fingers along the splintered grain. Aldrich's shadow fell over him. Brooding will not mend it. "I thought I was ready," Thomas said quietly. "You thought wrong," Aldrich replied. "But thinking wrong is not a sin. Staying wrong is." Thomas looked up, uncertain whether it was scolding or a lesson. The knight continued, softer now. "Do you know why we used wood before steel?" Thomas shook his head. "Because failure must come, while it can still teach without killing. The wood breaks, but you live. The shield splinters, but you learn what pride costs." He bent down and picked up a piece of the shield, weighing it in his palm. "There is no shame in breaking what is meant to break, only in refusing to understand why it did." Thomas swallowed, the words sinking deep. "Then I'll understand, my lord." Aldrich nodded. "Good. Now mend it." Thomas blinked. "Mend it? You'll need it again, and I do not waste wood or lessons." It took him until dusk. He worked by the small side forge near the kitchens, scraping away splinters, binding the crack with thin strips of leather. The smell of pitch and smoke clung to his fingers. Each knot he tied felt like a small promise to do better. When Lady Eleanor passed by, she stopped to watch. "A patient hand," she said. He smiled faintly. "I'm trying, my lady." "You'll make a fine knight someday, Thomas. Not because you fight well, but because you mend what others throw away." He looked down at the patched shield. "Its scars plain. It doesn't look fine, though. Neither does courage," she replied. "But both hold, when it matters." That night, after the castle quieted, Thomas sat by the hearth again. The room glowed soft gold. His repaired shield rested beside him. Aldrich entered, carrying 2 cups of watered wine. He handed one to Thomas, a rare kindness. "Tell me," he said, "what did you learn today?" Thomas thought for a moment. "That strength is nothing without patience." Aldrich nodded. And that even broken things can still protect. The knight smiled slightly. Then perhaps the day wasn't wasted. They sat in silence for a time, the crackle of the fire filling the space between them. The wind brushed faintly against the shutters, like fingers turning a page. Thomas looked into the flames. Sir, may I ask something? Always. Did you ever fail before you became a knight? Aldrich's eyes softened. Every man who ever wore this mantle has. I once dropped my sword in battle, fell clean from my hand. Thomas blinked. What did you do? I picked it up, Aldrich said simply, and swore I'd never let it happen again. The simplicity of it struck Thomas not as a tale of glory, but one of quiet resolve. When Aldrich rose to leave, he paused by the door. The shield will break again someday. Everything does. But when it does, I expect you'll be ready. And with that, he was gone. Thomas sat there for a long while, watching the light fade. The repaired shield seemed to glow faintly, its cracks dark against the firelight. Not flaws, but reminders. He touched the rough edge once more. I'll be ready, he whispered to the empty room. In the courtyard outside, the last embers of day drifted like fireflies, caught in the cold breath of evening. Somewhere far above, an owl called once, then fell silent, and in that quiet, Thomas felt something shift. Not the end of childhood, not yet, but the beginning of understanding what it meant to keep a promise, even when no one was watching. That night, his dreams were gentler. No battles, no victories, just the sound of rain on wood, and the echo of Aldrich's voice, steady as stone, soft as prayer. The lesson of the broken shield would follow him long after sleep, and long after the castle itself grew quiet with age, because some promises, once forged, never rust. Chapter 3. The Lady's Challenge. The rain began before dawn. Not a storm, just the kind that whispered against the windows, steady and patient, like fingers brushing parchment. The castle felt wrapped in gray silk. Every sound was softer. Every breath seemed to wait for something unseen. Thomas awoke to it, listening before he moved. The drops fell on the wooden shutters, a lullaby older than any song he knew. For a moment, he imagined he was back home, before knighthood, before duty, just a farmer's son beneath a thatched roof. But the rooster crowed, and the memory drifted away. He rose and dressed, his fingers finding familiar knots in his belt. The repaired shield rested near his bed, patched and ready. He ran his hand along the leather binding, the scars smooth now beneath his touch. In the courtyard, puddles gathered in the cracks between cobblestones. The horses shifted in their stalls, stamping against the chill. Thomas fetched a bucket, feeling the cold seep through his gloves as he filled it from the well. Steam rose faintly from the surface, the warmth of earth meeting the bite of morning. Sir Aldrich was away that week, summoned to the Earl's manor to discuss some border dispute. His absence made the castle feel strangely lighter, like a classroom without a teacher, quieter but uncertain what to do next. In his place, Lady Eleanor oversaw the household. Her leadership was quiet, efficient, and kind. She saw everything: the missing broom in the corridor, the uneaten loaf in the kitchen, the tired eyes of the maids. That morning, she stood by the great hearth in the main hall, her hands folded. Thomas bowed as he entered. "Good morning, my lady." "Good morning, Thomas," she said. "You look as though you've wrestled the rain itself." He smiled faintly. "It won. She laughed in a soft, warm sound that made the cold room seem smaller. You'll dry soon enough. I have a task for you today, if you're willing. Always, my lady. She nodded toward a wooden chest at her feet. There are letters that must reach the abbey at Dunsfield. Sir Aldrich usually sends a guard, but the roads are quiet, and you've proven careful. You'll ride alone. Thomas blinked. Alone, my lady? Do you doubt yourself? He hesitated. Only the horse. Then trust both, she said simply. There is no courage without a little trembling. He bowed again. I'll go at once. She handed him the sealed pouch of letters. And Thomas. He looked up. Remember, the world beyond these walls doesn't always speak the same language of honor we do here. Kindness will serve you better than pride. He nodded, her words tucking themselves quietly into his heart. By midday, the rain had softened to mist. Thomas mounted Rowan and set off down the winding path that led from Branton Castle to the abbey. The countryside opened around him, rolling fields, bare trees, the scent of wet earth rising like breath. The world looked washed clean, yet lonely. He rode at a steady pace, the pouch tied securely to his belt. Every so often, he glanced back at the castle, its gray towers fading into fog. There was a strange comfort in knowing it was still there. Even when unseen, hours passed. The road curved through a small village, with thatched roofs glistening with rain, children chasing puddles, and a woman hanging linen that refused to dry. Thomas offered a polite nod to those he passed, his manners stitched carefully into every gesture. As he reached the edge of the village, he noticed a commotion near the old bridge. Two farmers stood arguing with a tall man in a dark cloak. Between them lay a broken cartwheel, half sunk in mud. Thomas slowed his horse. The man in the cloak looked up with sharp eyes beneath a hood, his voice rough. You there, boy? Give us a hand. Thomas hesitated. He was under orders. The letters were his duty, but Lady Eleanor's words echoed in his mind. Kindness will serve you better than pride. He dismounted. What happened? The cart's stuck, one farmer said. Axle cracked clean. We've been here an hour. The cloaked man crossed his arms, and your friend here thought shouting at it might fix it. Thomas hid a smile. I can fetch a branch to brace it. Together they worked, sleeves soaked, boots heavy with mud. Thomas used his sword's flat edge to wedge the wheel free. It took effort, patience, and more than one muttered prayer. But finally, the cart shifted. The wheel locked back in place with a satisfying thud. There, Thomas said, brushing his hands on his tunic. The farmers grinned, offering thanks, but the cloaked man only watched. You're no farmer's boy, he said slowly. That sword's too fine. Thomas's hand went instinctively to the hilt. I serve at Branton Castle. The man's gaze lingered a moment longer. Then he nodded. Aldrich's squire, then. I thought so. You know Sir Aldrich? I knew him, the man said. Once. Something in the tone made Thomas uneasy. Before he could ask more, the stranger mounted his horse and rode off, leaving the mud to settle behind him. The farmers waved their goodbyes, and Thomas continued, the letters growing heavier at his side. By the time he reached Dunsfield Abbey, the sun had already begun its slow descent. The monks received him warmly, offering bread and warm broth. He delivered the pouch, signed the ledger, and prepared to leave before nightfall. But as he turned to go, one of the monks, An older man with gentle eyes spoke. "You are Aldrich's boy, are you not?" "I serve him, yes, father." The monk nodded. "Then tell him the abbey's roof leaks again. He'll know what that means." Thomas frowned. "I will, father." Outside, the sky bruised purple. He rode home quickly, the air sharp with the promise of night. By the time the castle came into view, the moon was rising over its towers. Pale and cold, Lady Eleanor met him in the courtyard, lantern in hand. "You returned safely." "Yes, my lady." He dismounted, offering the monk's message. "He said you'd understand." She smiled faintly. "Ah, the abbey roof is Aldrich's code. It means their stores are low. He'll arrange a delivery when he returns." Thomas hesitated, then added, "I met a man on the road. Said he knew Sir Aldrich once." Her expression changed. Not alarm, exactly, but concern threaded with memory. "A tall man? Wore a cloak even in daylight?" "Yes." She exhaled softly. "That would be Sir Brand. He and Aldrich trained together, long ago. They were close, until a matter of honor parted them." "Over what?" "Over pride," she said simply. "Which of them had more? I could never tell." Thomas said nothing. He thought of the broken shield, of the lessons in silence. Lady Eleanor studied him a moment longer. "You did well today, Thomas. You carried duty and mercy together. That balance will make you strong." He bowed, warmth rising in his chest despite the cold. As he turned to leave, she called after him, "Tomorrow, we'll see if your sword hand is as steady as your heart." He smiled to himself, though fatigue pressed on his shoulders. That night, as he lay in his cot, the rain returned. Each drop on the shutters was like a memory of mud, laughter, and the quiet strength it took to stop when others might ride past. He thought of Lady Eleanor's words, of the cloaked stranger's eyes, of the way kindness had felt like courage. And before sleep claimed him, he whispered to the darkness, "A promise kept is never small." Outside, the rain kept falling, washing the world clean again. Chapter 4. A Knight's Return. The first sign of Sir Aldrich's return was not the sound of hooves, but the echo of the horn. It drifted over the valley just after dawn, one long note, low and certain, cutting through the mist like memory through a dream. Thomas was already awake. He'd been oiling his sword by the hearth, the soft scrape of cloth on steel marking the rhythm of another quiet morning. The horn stilled his hand. His heart quickened, though he didn't know why. By the time he reached the courtyard, the gates were opening. Hooves splashed through shallow puddles. The air smelled of wet leather and travel, the scent of journeys that carried stories on their back. Sir Aldrich rode at the front, his cloak dark with rain, his armor dulled by mud. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate. He looked older, though it had only been a week, the kind of tired that doesn't come from battle, but from decisions. "Welcome home, my lord," Thomas said, bowing. Aldrich nodded, then passed his gloves to a page. "The Earl sends his peace," he said, voice even. "And his problems." Lady Eleanor appeared from the doorway, her presence a warmth against the cold stone. "Then come inside, before either grows heavier." A faint smile touched Aldrich's lips. Wise as ever, they walked together through the hall. Thomas followed at a respectful distance, carrying his master's satchel. Inside the great chamber, the hearth burned bright. Aldrich stood before it, silent for a long moment. Finally, he said, "The Earl is raising men." Eleanor looked up sharply. "For war?" For defense, he says. But defense often looks like preparation. Thomas's stomach tightened. He had seen maps marked in ink and worry, heard whispers among the squires, rumors of raids across the northern border, of nights called home too soon. Aldrich noticed the boy's expression. Do not fear, Thomas. War rarely begins when it's expected. It prefers to creep, not crash. He removed his cloak and draped it over a chair. But we will prepare nonetheless. Fetch the squires. Training doubles until the week's end. Yes, my lord. Thomas hurried to obey, though his thoughts lagged. When the drills began, the yard filled with noise, the thud of shields, the hiss of blades, the shouted rhythm of commands. Aldrich moved among them like a storm contained, correcting, instructing, never raising his voice, but somehow making silence heavy where it fell. Again, he said, a knight's first strike must be calm, not cruel. Thomas practiced until sweat stung his eyes. His shield, still patched from before, held firm. Aldrich noticed. You mended it well. Thomas managed a breathless grin. I learned from a patient teacher. For a moment, the knight's eyes softened. Then that teacher may yet have hope. They trained until the light began to fade. When Aldrich finally dismissed them, Thomas lingered. His arms shook from exhaustion, but his heart was full. He had never felt so seen. That night, he found Aldrich in the armory, polishing his helm. The glow of the forge painted both their faces in quiet gold. May I ask something, my lord? Thomas said. Ask. Why do knights fight truly? Is it for glory? Aldrich didn't look up. Glory is noise. It fades. A true knight fights to keep others from needing to. Thomas frowned. But when peace never lasts, doesn't it feel hopeless? Aldrich smiled faintly. You mend a shield, knowing it will break again, don't you? Yes, my lord. Then you already know the answer. They stood in silence after that. The kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. The next day, the castle stirred with more visitors. Messengers, traders, soldiers on leave. The air smelled of travel, parchment, and stories. Thomas carried supplies from the storehouse to the hall, passing snippets of conversation. Words like borders, raiders, and alliance. Near the stables, he heard one that made him pause. Sir Brand's men were seen near the marsh road. The name felt cold on his tongue. The man from the bridge. That evening, Lady Eleanor found Thomas near the kitchen, helping the cook move sacks of flour. You've heard, haven't you? She asked gently. Yes, my lady. Is he dangerous? Not in the way you think, she said. Sir Brand believes Aldrich wronged him once. He's been wandering ever since, gathering those who share his bitterness. Why doesn't Sir Aldrich tell him the truth? She smiled sadly. Because truth spoken in anger becomes a weapon, not a bridge. Her words stayed with him. 2 days later, Aldrich called Thomas to the ramparts. The morning sun cut through low fog, turning the fields to silver. Do you see the horizon, Thomas? Yes, my lord. What do you see? Fields, smoke, the forest line. And beyond that? Thomas hesitated. I don't know. Exactly, Aldrich said quietly. That is a knight's burden, to act for what lies beyond what he can see. Thomas turned toward him. Is that why you became one? Aldrich's eyes softened. No, I became one because I was young, foolish, and wanted to be remembered. I stayed one because I learned remembrance means nothing if it isn't kind. They stood there together, watching the fog lift. Somewhere below, a blackbird sang. Later that afternoon, a messenger arrived Cloaked, mud-splattered, carrying a small scroll. Aldrich read it once, twice, then folded it slowly. He handed it to Lady Eleanor. She read in silence, her brow tightening. "What is it?" Thomas asked. "The Earl calls all knights of Branton to assemble at dawn," Aldrich said. "We ride north." Thomas's breath caught. "To fight, to serve," Aldrich said simply, "and sometimes they are the same thing." That night, the castle was restless. Armor clanked. Horses shifted in their stalls. Thomas moved through it, all like a ghost, helping where he could, tightening straps, fetching oil, whispering quiet reassurances to the younger pages who couldn't hide their fear. In the great hall, Aldrich sat alone, sharpening his blade. The sound was soft but steady, a heartbeat in steel. Thomas entered quietly. "Will you take me with you, my lord?" Aldrich looked up. The boy's eyes were clear, determined. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, "A squire's first promise is to serve where he is most needed. That may not be beside me." Thomas's face fell. Though he tried to hide it, Aldrich set the blade down. "But your time will come. And when it does, it won't be bravery that carries you. It will be what you learn in the waiting." Thomas bowed. "I understand, my lord." "Do you?" Aldrich said softly. "Waiting is its own kind of battle." Before dawn, the horn sounded again, not for return, but for departure. The courtyard was filled with the pale light of torches. Men mounted their horses, armor whispering against leather. Lady Eleanor stood by the gate, her face calm, though her hands were clasped tightly. Thomas stood beside her, holding Aldrich's repaired shield, the one from the lesson, its cracks still visible, but strong. Aldrich took it, weighing it for a moment. "You've made this a fine thing," he said. "It's yours again, my lord." The knight looked at him. "No, Thomas. It was never mine alone." He handed it back. "Keep it, until I return." Thomas's throat tightened. "You promise?" Aldrich smiled, the kind of smile that carried both warmth and farewell. "I promise." Then he turned his horse, lifted the visor of his helm, and rode into the mist. The sound of hooves faded slowly like a heartbeat, retreating into the distance. Thomas stood there, long after the last rider disappeared. The morning light spread across the empty yard, soft and pale. He looked down at the shield in his hands, heavy, scarred, and full of silence. Lady Eleanor placed a hand on his shoulder. "Now the real test begins." He looked up. "How, my lady?" "By keeping faith," she said, "even when there's no one left to see it." That night, the castle slept uneasily. The rain returned once more, washing the stones, whispering along the roofs. Thomas lay awake, listening, the shield beside his bed. He imagined Aldrich on the road, riding through fog, through memory, toward whatever waited beyond the horizon. And before sleep took him, Thomas whispered the same vow he'd made since the beginning: to protect what cannot protect itself, to do what is right even when it burns. The candle beside him guttered once, as if it heard and approved. Then the room fell still, and the promise waited quietly, unbroken. Chapter 5. The Letter and the Lantern. The castle changed when Sir Aldrich rode north, not with a thunderclap, but with a slow, careful sigh, the kind of exhale that happens when someone you love walks out of the room and you realize the house will have to learn a new rhythm without them. At first, the change was hardly more than a rearrangement. A chair moved a little closer to the hearth, a pair of boots left in a different place, the bell rung by a hand that paused before letting it fall. These were small things, but they shifted the angles of daily life. And that is how loss often begins, not with a crack, but with the subtle way light falls through a window when a familiar face is not there to meet it. Thomas kept his work as he always had. He dawned early, tied the lantern's wick with a patient thumb, and thumbed the leather of his gauntlets into readiness. The routines were his fortress. He cleaned blades until they hummed in the light, fed the horses with a voice that spoke each animal's name, like a prayer, and tended the lantern Aldrich had left him, as though it were a pact bound in iron and cloth. The lantern was small, iron-ribbed, and often clouded with the faint smoke of many nights, but its flame was a different thing altogether, a promise made visible. The household watched him, sometimes with curiosity, sometimes with a kind of quiet awe. The other squires joked at first, calling it a superstition fit for maids and monks, but they stopped their laughter when they saw how Thomas bowed to the lamp and how he drew the flame closer when storms raged. In time, the lantern came to symbolize something practical and spiritual at once, a talisman to remind the household of the promises they'd made, and a literal light to guide a steady heart through long winter hours. The days stretched, each like a small bead on a prayer rope. Thomas found his hands busy with things that, in the rush of other moments, would have felt trivial: mending a strap, stitching a torn sleeve, arranging a shard of broken crockery as though it were a small altar. In these tasks, he found a rhythm that matched the hush of waiting. Waiting, he learned, was not idle. It was a kind of tending. Lady Eleanor kept the household steady, where Aldrich had been a wide river, rushing, decisive, sometimes rough. Eleanor was the soft bank that guided it. She handled coin, food, and people with the careful patience of someone who knew that sharp decisions can damage what they intend to save. To Thomas, she was both guardian and mirror. She would watch him when he tended the lantern, and sometimes touch the glass lid to feel its warmth, as if to reassure herself that promise could be held in hand. When the messenger first came from the north with the news that the ford might be lost and that battles had been fought, they received him with the careful forms that keep households whole. The letters were read and folded and put aside. Tasks were dispatched to men who could carry them. But the weeks that followed brought no horn from the north, no small scrap of news. Silence, which at first feels like a polite thing, turned heavy as a sack of grain. Still, Thomas kept to his duties. He polished armor that would not soon be worn. He spread straw where water threatened to gather, and he checked the lantern each sunrise as though the flame were a small piece of the man who had lit it for him. Over time, his simple ritual became a quiet classroom for the household. Younger squires came to watch how he trimmed a wick, how he judged the oil's clarity, how he shielded a small light from drafts, the way a father shields a sleeping child. On an evening when the rain had ceased and the world smelt like the inside of a snail shell, close, warm, a little damp, Thomas was in the armory, arranging helmets when his hand brushed something unexpected inside Aldrich's helm. The helm had been hung for weeks, and he had not moved it. Yet there it was, a folded sheet of parchment sealed with wax that bore the hawk and branch sigil Aldrich had carried to every muster. It might have been easy to think the parchment had been there all along, an object ready to be found when the time called for its reading. Yet the way the letter trembled in his hand felt like an answer reaching from the dark. He broke the wax with fingers that remembered the memory of 1,000 other small acts, the opening of packages, the carving of bread, and read. The handwriting was Aldrich's, deliberate, the letters leaning slightly, as if eager to move forward, as if there had been a hurry to say what must be said. To my squire, Thomas, if this reaches you, then my road has done what all roads do, and taken me beyond the sound you know. Read this slowly, as one reads the folds of a map, marking the safe paths, and where the bramble grows dense. War is noisier than I ever told you. It is not only a clash of steel, but a meeting of stubbornness. It is the loudness of small cruelties, collected and set like teeth against the soft things in the world. You should not be surprised if you find that the world's music sometimes promises more than it gives. Do not let that be why you harden. A hardened heart will cut what it was meant to protect. Keep yours gentle. Keep a lantern lit. If you must leave the warmth of the hearth, carry the light in your hand. There is a chest beneath the east stair, wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, you will find a small iron lantern. It is not bright, but it tends to be true. Keep it lit. Keep the lid closed when the winds rage, and the flame will last. If word comes that I am gone, do not let the silence break you. Many promises will be spoken at bells. More will be broken. Remember my promise, and keep it for me if I cannot. Teach another the small things. How to sew a torn strap. How to oil leather. How to listen when men speak softly and mean harder than they let on. Aldrich. The letter weighed on Thomas like a livelihood made of words. It carried grief and command, but also that odd, gentle humor Aldrich sometimes showed when he wanted to lighten the load. Thomas folded the parchment back into itself and, as if on instinct, went to the east stair, where beneath the low steps he found a chest wrapped in oilcloth as the letter had said. He unwrapped it with trembling fingers and discovered a lantern small enough to fit in his palm. Its iron was blackened by years of use. Its glass was faintly clouded, as if it had watched many nights. That night, he lit that lantern. Its flame was not a shout. It was a whisper. It bent and steadied, in a way Thomas found almost like a recognition, as if it, too, bore memory. When he set it upon the sill of his little window, the light touched the wood and the stone and seemed to make them softer. He sat for a long time holding it, and when he finally set it down near the hearth, the whole household felt as though some small thing had shifted back into place. Lady Eleanor found him with the lantern and sat beside him. They watched the flame together. "He sent you this?" she asked. "He did," Thomas said. She pressed the glass with her fingertips, smiling faintly. "Then he trusted you with more than his sword. He gave you a way to remember." Days passed. The lantern became a quiet companion. Thomas placed it, sometimes, in the armory. Other times, he hung it in the kitchen. It was a small discipline. Light it each morning, tend it through chores, douse it at night unless the weather was cruel. The squires began to gather, not mockingly this time, but as if they had been given a guide to better conduct. They watched Thomas wind the wick and measure the oil, the way he always tilted his head to watch how the flame leaned. It became a minor education and a practice in steadiness. And then, one early dusk, as the leaves began to show the first stain of autumn, a rider came to the gate. He dismounted with the awkwardness of a man who had seen much and had been made too old by it. He had a cloak of a color Thomas had seen on men who rode from the north, a somber blue that could pass for shadow when night fell. His face was shaded with beard and dust. His hands trembled with a small fatigue that seemed to belong to the bone and not the will. Thomas's chest tightened. Hope pressed against the rib cage like a hand. "Sir Aldrich," the messenger said, before Thomas had time to ask. He was seen near Klein's Ford. The castle listened as the man spoke. His words were careful, descriptive, and at times his voice broke like wood underfoot. The ford, he said, had been lost and retaken in the same week. Banners had shifted like fish over a net. Men had bled and been buried where grave markers would later be. There was a hush after he spoke that felt almost like the end of a prayer. Even so, days later, when Thomas found a second note tucked beneath Aldrich's helm now, when he was again cleaning and arranging armor, it had a different tone. The letter's words were slower and more intimate. "If this is read in a room that still has a fire, then I leave you this light as a trust. If the room is quiet and the hearth is cold, then let the lantern be the warmth. Burn it when you must. Give it when you can. It will guide you not just through the night, but through the soft confusion of people's needs, which are sometimes louder than steel." Thomas's hands did not falter as he read. The letters were small but sure. He felt at once an odd peace. The knight had planned as if his absence might be long, and had made room for the household to remember not only a man but the way he thought. He wrapped the lantern in linen and kept it close as a person keeps a name in their mouth until it becomes comfortable to say. In the weeks that followed, life at Branton found new rhythms. The lantern was placed on a low shelf near the training yard and set alight each morning. Its small warmth seemed to ask nothing but to be tended. The squires adopted the practice as a kind of silent oath. Those who lit the lantern were given the right to speak last at the end of the day, the chance to close the small circles of gossip and to steer them back toward gentleness. Thomas found that the lantern affected how he moved in the world. He began to notice small cruelties and to tend to them. A traitor cheating a widow of a bag of grain would not be met with a sword. He would be met with a ledger, a witness, and a slow, patient accounting until the book balanced. A child of a tenant who could not pay a tax would be offered work in the garden. These were not cinematic acts of heroism. They were the tedious, consoling labor of keeping a community alive. The lantern's glow seemed to teach that light could be kept as much by patience and law as by steel. In the hush of autumn, a man in a dark cloak appeared at the bridge outside the village. He was alone, and his figure made the mist look like something moved by hands. Thomas remembered the face from months prior, the man who had known Aldrich once. He watched from a distance as the stranger spoke with the villagers, his voice low, his gestures not unkind. Later that week, the man passed through the castle gates. He came to the yard and watched the squires train in silence, then approached the lantern that sat on its low shelf. "You keep this well," he said, and his voice sounded exactly the way a road feels when it has been traveled for a long time, worn, patient, and a little wary. Thomas bowed. "It is kept for memory and for use." He kept his tone steady. "It is not for show." The man whom Thomas now knew as Sir Brandt, by reputation, a name not always spoken in comfort, paused and then nodded. "Aldrich trusted you. He was a good man." The words were small, but they seemed to settle across the yard like dust finding a shelf. Their exchange was brief and unremarkable. Yet that evening, when the candles were snuffed and the lantern's flame steadied, Lady Eleanor said to Thomas that day and night had a way of circling back on themselves. People return, she said. They carry their roads with them. Some come for forgiveness, some for grievance. Whether they find the same road when they return depends on what we've kept lit. Thomas thought of that often afterward. He thought of men like Brandt, who carried their hurts like stones, sometimes wanting to hurl them at the world to see what broke. He thought of Aldrich and how he had borne a friendship that might have cracked under pride, and he realized the smallness of the lantern's influence in the larger shape of things. It could not stop every sorrow, nor did it promise that the world would be kind. It promised only that someone would remember to be steady. Winter came in hard this year, and with it came need. The Earl called certain houses to muster, not for war, but for assistance, to bring grain to towns where the frost had taken much, to help shore a bridge that would otherwise fail, to carry wood farther than the old men could. Branton sent men and wagons. Thomas organized the convoys, allotting oil and rations, and deciding who would carry what. He tied the lantern securely in its cradle in one wagon, so its light would be the first seen in the long nights on the road. On the road, the lantern worked in ways he had not expected. In a small village where ice had closed doors and the innkeeper had almost given up, the lantern's warm circle was a small miracle. People gathered around the glow as if it were a small sun, and stories started again. An old woman recounted a harvest tale. A boy found the courage to speak, and a tired father laughed at a joke that had been forgotten. Thomas realized then that the lantern's influence was not mystical. It was a focus, a reason to sit together and speak. It made the company, while the frost tried to make people keep to themselves. When they returned to Branton, the roads were slick with water, and the nights long. But the household seemed knotted stronger than before. The lantern had been carried through storms and lullabies, and had remained steadfast. Thomas understood, with a small, gentle thrill, that promises, when tended, become part of the place that tends them. One late evening, under a sky smeared with slow-moving stars, a rider came, not Aldrich, not the man himself, but a messenger with a small scrap of metal and an explanation. The bridge at Klein's Ford had been lost, the messenger said plainly, but not without meaning. Men were wounded, yes. Some had been carried away in the night. Yet there had been a choice. Several knights who might have pursued vengeance had chosen a different path. They had held a makeshift court, and with bedsheets and simple testimony, had chosen to restore rather than destroy. The messenger's eyes held a light of their own when he spoke of it. The party that had once been called on to fight had instead chosen mercy when they could have let anger rule them. Thomas listened and felt a warmth that was not the lantern's, but something like it. He thought of Aldrich's letter, now more clearly, a call not to harden, but to keep gentleness, even when the world's music is harsh. The next morning, Thomas found Lady Eleanor standing at the hearth, her hands still. He went to her without being called, and found her holding a scrap of parchment, a later note from the north that spoke simply of a name and a place. It did not say what he had wanted it to say. It did not give closure on the question of Aldrich's fate. Yet in its lines, Thomas found something else, the repeated refrain of duty kept. "We will remember him," Lady Eleanor said quietly. The months that followed were neither empty nor full. They simply lived. The household survived storms and heat, births and deaths of animals, and seasons of lean coin and sudden harvests. The lantern kept its place on the shelf by the yard. The squires studied beside it, and sometimes argued about which wick length gave the best light. Thomas taught them to measure oil with a thumb, and not to waste flame on idle vanity. On a soft spring morning, when the fields smelled of green and the sky was the color of shallow water, a figure came walking up the lane to the castle. He moved slowly, leaning on a staff as if his feet had been taught to be careful. The stranger's cloak was plain, his boots scuffed and new. He approached the gate in a small, unassuming way, and found himself turned aside only by the habit of wariness. Yet when the gate opened and the lantern's glow spilled across his face, it was as if he recognized the light and the people who kept it. He had the face of someone who had known too many battles, and his voice carried the texture of that knowledge. He introduced himself simply as a traveler who had once known Aldrich on a road far to the north. He had stories not of glory, but of small mercies. Aldrich binding a child's broken wrist in a barn, Aldrich sharing bread with a weary messenger, Aldrich refusing to strike a surrendered foe. He had stories that softened rather than sharpened, and he stayed for a while as a guest and then as a friend. Thomas listened and recorded these tales, not as proof of his master's virtues, but as threads in a tapestry. The traveler left as travelers do, with a small bow and a promise to visit again, but he left a seed of certainty. Aldrich had grown into a man who taught gentleness more than he taught ferocity. Years passed. The lantern's flame moved from oil to oil, wick to wick, and a new generation learned how to keep small fires alive. The world beyond Branton moved as well. Lords changed, roads improved, taxes grew and shrank. But in the yard, the ritual held. Young squires grew into men who could carry burdens without letting them become bitter. They mended seams and shields, and they learned how to listen. One late autumn evening, when the air was cool enough to make breath small and bright, Thomas took the lantern down the stairs alone to the armory. He had kept the lantern longer than he thought he would. It had become part of the way the place balanced itself, a rule not written on parchment, but lived by a dozen hands each day. He held it gently and felt its small weight. He had added an extra layer of oil for the winter and wound a finer wick into place. Emrys, who had become a steady man in his own right, met him at the top of the stairs with a question that was both simple and heavy. "Sir Thomas," he said, clearing his throat, "when you first showed us the lantern, I thought it was a superstition, but now I find it hard to start my day without seeing it. Why did Aldrich trust you with it?" Thomas smiled and placed the lantern on the low bench. "Because he knew I would keep it lit. Because he trusted me to remember. He made a promise by giving me a small thing, a tool that forced me to practice care. He wanted someone to remind our house that promises are kept not in ceremony, but in daily tending." Emrys leaned forward as if to keep the light in his face. "And what does it say when we keep it?" "It says that we will try," Thomas answered, "that we will do the small acts that stop a small sorrow from becoming a great one, that we will prefer repair to ruin, that we will listen more than we strike." Emrys nodded, as if the answer fit him. He took the lantern and held it before him, feeling its meek warmth. The light painted his face, and made him look younger and older at once. The seasons turned. The old men passed like slow weather. Aldrich, whose grave under the oak would forever be a place of small pilgrimage for the household, was remembered in stories told at supper. Thomas, the one who kept the lantern, grew wrinkles that were maps of long gentleness. Emrys became a man who could do both: hold a sword and take the longer view when a sword would not help. On some nights, when a storm hammered the roofs and the world seemed intent on forgetting kindness, young squires would look toward the armory and the shelf where the lantern hung. They would ask when the light had first been brought there, and would hear the story of a knight who had written a letter and a squire who had learned how to keep a flame. They would hear it not as legend, but as instruction, a small model for how to go on. And so the candle continued. The lantern that Aldrich had left in trust had become a house rule, a promise made visible. It taught men how to be steady so that they might keep being decent, especially on days the weather and the world conspired to make decent things harder. The lantern's light never solved every wrong. It did not fight wars for them or make laws for them, but it taught a practice: to sit with people, to feed them, to patch the torn things, to hold a light so others could find their way. Some years later, those who had come to Branton looking for stout armor and a sharp blade left speaking also of the way the men there could listen and tend. Travelers began to carry the story out across country lanes and market squares that Branton kept something curious and small, a lantern and the habit of gentleness, that, for many, became the real legacy of a knight who had once taught his squire how to mend a shield and how to mind a lamp. There is a time for great gestures and a time for small ones. The world sometimes forgets which to choose. At Branton, under the slow arc of roofs and the patience of the keep, they remembered the small things. They kept the lantern lit. They mended what was broken, and they taught another to do the same. And in the slow hush of evening, when tea cooled and the fire settled, Thomas would stand by the door and look out at the road that led north. He would think of Aldrich and his letter, and of the way a small iron lamp had come to house so much meaning. He would feel that it had been enough, not a grand rescue, not a glorious victory, but something steadier, a web of small, deliberate acts that, taken together, became a quiet protection. Chapter 6. The Knight's Promise. The years after Sir Aldrich's return unfolded slowly, as if the world itself had decided to savor each small mercy. Days curled into months, like the quiet smoke that rose from the kitchen chimneys. Seasons turned with a soft patience, and Branton Castle learned again how to breathe without the sharp intake that comes before a storm. Thomas walked through that learned breath as one who had practiced a long, slow hymn, his steps measured, his hands steady, his thoughts finding rhythm in small, careful work. Morning light continued to arrive the same way it always had, pale and certain, and Thomas was there each day to meet it. He rose before most, not because he had to, but because habit had made it into a devotion. He cleaned the armory until the blades sang in the light. He fed the horses and spoke to them as if words could teach steadiness, and he tended the lantern Aldrich had left him, carrying its quiet glow into gray mornings and long evenings. The lantern became more than a relic. It was a lesson received and given. It taught him to keep flame where darkness might otherwise gather. It taught him to tend the small things that over time defend the larger ones. Time softened Aldrich in ways that neither of them noticed at first. He was slower at the drills. His hand trembled sometimes when he reached for a cup. He laughed less at the table, though when he laughed, the sound was warm and brief, like a folded note. He read less mail aloud, preferring to listen to the crackle of the hearth and the soft steps of people he trusted. He took pleasure in small things: a loaf properly baked, a pair of gloves stitched true, the quiet of the garden after rain. Thomas watched these changes not as loss, but as a shifting of weight from one shoulder to another, a handing over that felt like a promise being tied again, only now with new knots. The youth who had once knelt at Aldrich's feet to have the knight show him where to hold a blade had long since become a man. There were lines on Thomas's hands where rope and leather had left their marks. His voice had deepened to the warm baritone that made the younger boys listen, even when he only spoke the simplest of orders. In quiet moments, he would find himself remembering small lessons on how Aldrich steadied his own breath in the face of chaos, how Lady Eleanor would fold a letter in three before setting it aside, the exact way the lantern's flame leaned when the wind was honest. These were sacred things, not because they were grand, but because they taught the shape of human steadiness, how to continue without spectacle, how to keep tending after applause had faded. The castle's life settled around Thomas like a pattern. New squires arrived in time, awkward and noisy, each one eager to practice and make a place for himself. Thomas taught them as Aldrich had taught him, not with bluster, but with small, repeated actions that, day by day, built skill into habit. He showed them how to clean a sword blade, not by polishing it until it flashed like a star, but by removing tiny flakes of rust before they could grow into a wound. He taught them to oil a harness so it would not crack in winter. He told them stories of quiet courage, not those sung about on banners, but ones of men who stayed by houses during winter storms, of women who stitched the wounds of a battlefield and spoke of home at the same time. The squires listened because they wanted to be like him, and they wanted to be like Aldrich, too. They wanted someone to teach them not just how to fight, but how to remember. There were, of course, days when the old lessons returned to test him. A band of raiders once crept down the marsh road in late autumn, and the castle raised its gates and its voices. Thomas found himself riding with men he had trained, steady-eyed lads who, in the face of danger, did not shout, but did what they had been taught. They kept the gates closed. They moved supplies out of sight, and they carried the weak where needed. When the raiders came near and assessed the castle as too well prepared for a quiet spoil, they moved on, muttering about luck more than courage. Afterward, no dinner was triumphant. Men sat quietly, eating slowly. Thomas moved among them, like the lantern's light, offering clean bandages and a dry blanket. There was no glory to be sung. There was maintenance of life. That maintenance felt like victory, and it was. Aldrich's health, however, became the slow question that hung in the air like a distant bell. Some mornings he rose and joined the drills. Some mornings he could hardly stand. The household learned the pattern of his fatigue and arranged around it. Less armor swinging when the old man was present, more mending and music, and the soft tasks that do not demand the quickness of youth. The boy who had once idolized the knight now found himself offering to hold cups, to fetch wraps, to read letters aloud, so Aldrich's eyes could rest. Aldrich accepted these things with a pride softened to gratitude, and Thomas felt that gratitude returned to him like a warmth. One evening in late winter, when the world outside held its breath under snow, Thomas found Aldrich sitting by the east window, where the light came thin and cold. The old knight held the lantern, as though he wished to feel the warmth against his palms. Snow whispered against the sill. For a long time, neither spoke. Thomas sat, simply holding a quiet that did not press for words. "Aldrich," Thomas said finally, using the man's name with the intimacy of many shared years. "You have been my life's shape." Aldrich looked at him and smiled, a small, private thing. "And you mine," he answered. "You carried what I could not say. That, Thomas, is a rare and holy thing." Thomas swallowed. "Will you teach me one last lesson?" he asked, because asking for lessons was how he showed care. It was how he always had. Aldrich's eyes brightened, not with strength, but with the light of memory. "Always," he said. "Teach me that a knight's duty is not only to the shield and the spear," Thomas began. "Teach me the shape of mercy again." Aldrich folded his hands on his knee. "It begins with admission," he said. "Admit the fear when it is honest, and do not pretend weakness where none exists. Mercy is not an absence of strength. It is a deliberate use of it. A man must know when his strength will help and when it will only add burden." "And how do you know?" Thomas asked, though he felt he already had some answer within him. "You feel it in your chest," Aldrich said, "not in the flaring heat of battle, but in the quiet that follows. If your hand wants to strike for vengeance, ask why. If it is to protect, then do. If it is to sate your own hurt, then find another way. A knight is more than force. He is the judgment of when to use it." Thomas listened as the snow settled on the world outside, feeling the lesson fit into his bones like a well-cut stone as spring came leanly that year. Branton Castle's rhythms shifted subtly. Aldrich did not return to drills with any regularity. He spent more time in the garden, where he would sit among herbs and caress petals, as if each were a small life to be protected. Thomas read to him tales from the abbey's homilies, and sometimes they would sit together watching the lantern's light and the shadows it made in the corners. Content with those small theatrics, the day Aldrich's body decided its own rest came softly, as truth always does. No trumpet, no sudden collapse, only a morning when his breath shallowed and his hand grew still in Thomas's. Thomas had been there, as he nearly always was, tending the knight's cup and speaking in the low voice Aldrich had taught him, a voice that calmed rather than commanded. When Aldrich's last breath left him, it was neither violent nor lonely. It was as if he had been carrying a long, long road behind his feet and finally laid the pack down. For a time, the castle's world held its breath. Lady Eleanor, who had been Aldrich's companion for more years than many could count, moved in a slow orbit of grief that was as composed as it was deep. They buried Aldrich beneath the old oak outside the eastern wall, a place where leaves would fall across the years, and where, in spring, the earth would green again. Thomas carried the lantern to the grave and set it upon the stone, its flame small, faithful, and golden. The light, held steady by his hand, seemed to promise that some things would be kept. After the burial, life did not return to normal, as if nothing had happened. Instead, it rearranged itself around absence. The meals became quieter, the jokes less frequent, the armor still polished, but without the steady, measured nod that Aldrich once gave approvingly. And yet, even in that rearrangement, Thomas found purpose. He kept the lantern lit, and he taught as Aldrich had taught him, through small repeated acts, through patient correction, through a steady hand given when required. He told stories of Aldrich, not as myth, but as a memory of the man who once dropped a sword in a river and still rose to meet his duty. And those stories became a kind of scripture for the squires who would follow. Years slipped forward like a slow tide. Thomas grew older, and the men he had once trained grew into their own shapes of steadiness. One young squire stood out in particular, a lithe, quiet boy named Emrys. Emrys had a shy smile and an honest fear that made him eager to learn. He reminded Thomas of himself at that age, a mix of yearning and clumsy courage. Thomas found himself drawn to the boy's steady desire for improvement, and before long, Emrys became Thomas's shadow, the one who fetched water and wiped blades, and learned, with patient repetition, the art of being useful. Under Thomas's guidance, Emrys learned not only how to swing a sword, but how to tend to the wounded, how to mend what had broken, and how to listen for the faintest changes in people's voices. He learned the ritual of lighting the lantern each morning, of trimming its wick and ensuring its oil was true. He learned to make small promises and keep them. Thomas watched these lessons take root, like seeds in rich soil. In time, Emrys's awkwardness melted into competence, and competence into the kind of quiet authority that did not need to be shouted. Among the many seasons that passed, there were moments when Thomas would stand by the outer wall and watch the road leading north. Sometimes his hand would find the repaired shield, the one that had once splintered and taught him patience, and he would run his fingers along its scar, feeling the memory of that first failure alive beneath his touch. Other times, his hand rested over his heart, as if to check the pulse of the promise he had sworn so many years ago. The pledge had become a sort of constant, not an obligation that crushed him, but a framework that let him know how to move through the world. One late afternoon, as the harvest waned and the light leaned toward gold, a messenger arrived bearing a tale that made the castle hold its breath for a different reason. There were whispers of trouble across the small baronies, petty conflicts, an enforced levy that strained men who had little, and an official who had taken to collecting more than he was owed. These matters did not call for a blade as much as for steady hands and level heads. The Earl asked Branton to send a small party of knights to mediate and, if possible, to restore balance. Thomas accepted without the fanfare of old days. He mounted with Emrys at his side and a small band of steady men, resolved to keep the peace more than to fight. It was a modest mission, but its modesty pleased him. On the road, Thomas found his old lessons returning with a new context. Some villagers hungered. Some men had been pushed into desperate choices by collectors who knew the weight of a coin better than the weight of a soul. Thomas listened long. He listened to farmers pleading for mercy, to an official pressed against a ledger that made the law look like a weapon. He listened to the voices of men on both sides, hearing not enemies, but people with burdens and histories. He spoke to the official in a voice steady and low, not accusing, but firm. He negotiated where he could. He used money from the Earl's coffers to ease a levy when he found it unjust. He arranged for work that allowed men to earn their dues rather than sell them. He found that a promise could be kept not only by warding off swords, but by mending the fragile economics that so often lead to violence. Emrys watched and learned in silence. He saw Thomas move like the lantern, shining where darkness threatened, and offering warmth rather than heat. The young squire learned that courage could be quiet, and that leadership often meant bearing the burden of other people's shame so they could lift their heads again. Emrys's eyes grew less timid with each act he witnessed. He learned to sit with villagers through the night and speak words of calm when worry gnawed best. In the years that followed, Thomas met the kinds of choices that slowly polish a man's soul. A band of outlaws once attempted a night raid on a nearby hamlet. Instead of meeting them with blade first, Thomas had the village ring a false alarm and set a trap, not one of steel, but of exposure. The outlaws were intercepted by those they had harmed earlier. They found themselves confronted by faces that remembered pain more vividly than they remembered fear. In that confrontation, some were forgiven. Others were given to justice, pursued by law. The act avoided bloodshed and returned honor to the household. Emrys learned the result. There are victories in which no one loudly triumphs, but everyone lives to tell a better tale. Time, however, is patient and unrelenting. One morning, when spring commanded the buds, Thomas felt the familiar small fatigue that speaks of age. His hair had silvered in places. His hands bore more lines of small repairs. His steps had learned to prefer a firm stone to an uncertain footing. Still, his heart remained steady. He continued to teach as he always had, drawing the younger men close and showing them how to temper the hard edges of duty with the soft ones of mercy. On a quiet evening, when the stars were clear and the air carried the scent of cut hay, Thomas sat by the lantern and listened to Emrys asking questions that were the right ones. Will I know when to be hard and when to be kind? How do I measure that? What if I fail? Thomas answered in his calm baritone, speaking slowly so the lessons could settle into the boy's bones. You will fail sometimes, he said at last. All of us do. But remember, failure is a way to learn if you let it. Do not pretend you are without fault. Own it, mend it, and teach what you learned to another. That is how we become bigger than our mistakes. Emrys listened, as if hearing scripture. He would, in years to come, stand in the same doorway and speak these words to his own students. One winter, when frost had etched the windows like constellations, Thomas felt his breath become a little shallower. He found himself rising more slowly in the morning and sitting longer beside the hearth. He no longer rose at the first bell. Instead, he watched the world wake and allowed others to carry the first burdens of the day. The lantern remained his devotion. He trimmed its wick with care and ensured its oil never ran low. Emrys took upon himself more duties, stepping up in ways that warmed Thomas's heart. The boy had become a man through the steady, patient work of being taught and of observing. When twilight came one evening, and Thomas felt a warmth in his chest that was not the hearth's, he called Emrys to his side. The young man came quickly, worry in his eyes. Emrys, Thomas said, his voice thick with a tenderness that had gathered over the years. Keep the lantern lit. Emrys, whose hands had mended shields, and who had fed the hungry, and who had come to learn the quiet of true courage, nodded. He understood. He had known this day might come. He had practiced the motions of care and had learned the words of steadiness. Thomas lay back, the old oak's shadow falling across the floor, and looked up at the beams. In his mind rose the faces of the many who had taught him and those he had taught back. Aldrich's rough smile, Lady Eleanor's steady hands, the laughing squires, the men who had been soothed rather than struck by his interventions. The lantern's flame beside him bent in the wind and rose again, obedient to care. "You have done well," he whispered, not to Emrys, but to the long line of promises that had held him. "Keep them." He took a breath that seemed to last forever, and as he exhaled, it was a gentle release, like the closing of a book at the end of a manuscript read well. Emrys sat with him until the light wavered and steadied, until the breath left Thomas's chest and the room smelled of lavender from the sachets Lady Eleanor had tucked beneath his pillow. There was sorrow, certainly, but it was threaded through with peace, the sort that comes when a life has been lived according to a chosen shape. The next morning, the castle mourned with softness. There were tears, and there were prayers, and there were small stories told of the man who had kept a lantern burning in storm and in calm. Emrys carried the lantern back to the courtyard and hung it in its customary place by the gate, its light a continuation of the light that had once guided Aldrich and then Thomas. The flame, unbroken, wavered and steadied, as if to say, "We will remember." Years after Thomas's passing, visitors to Branton would find a simple ritual. A young squire, eyes bright and serious, learning how to oil a blade and where to find the right knot for a harness. He would be taught, as Thomas had taught him, that the work is never glamorous, but that it matters. He would learn to keep his promises not as burdens, but as a song to which his days could dance. As time stretched on, that small lantern became a symbol for the household, not a relic of one man's piety, but a living practice of care passed down through steady hands. The shield, with its repaired scars, remained hung in the hall as a reminder that mending is as crucial as protecting. The stories of Aldrich, of Lady Eleanor, of Thomas, were told in low voices at the tables. They were not embellished nor forgotten. They traveled quietly and sturdily, like seeds carried on a slow wind. And so, the house that had once been taught by a knight who taught his squire how to mend more than to fight, became a place where other men were made steady. The promise, small in words, but vast in weight, lived on, not as a legend shouted from banners, but as a practiced attention. Light the lantern, tend the wound, feed the hungry. Listen before you strike, and teach what you have learned. At the end of many long evenings, when the stars came out, and the world settled into its softer breathing, the household would sing a small, hushed benediction, words not written for history, but for the small things that keep the night from swallowing the hearth. In that silence, if one listened very closely, they could hear the echo of footsteps through generations. Aldrich's heavy stride, Thomas's careful walk, Emrys's steady step following behind. It was the sound of a promise made and kept, not for glory, but for the simple, hard grace of people who choose, again and again, to be guardians of the gentle. And so, the night falls quiet, carrying their whispers into silence. If you enjoyed this tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, so you never miss another whisper in the night. Until we meet again, good night.